closely at a newly painted gray living room or a city block frozen by preservation laws, and a quiet anxiety starts to show. Two writers trace the blandness of modern environments straight back to a shared fear of making mistakes. In Works in Progress, Samuel Hughes explains how a backlash against ugly post-war buildings drove voters to lock down historic neighborhoods, terrified of what developers might build next. Meanwhile, Amogh Dimri writes in The Atlantic that financial pressure has trapped buyers in a colorless design recession, pushing them toward neutral tones just to protect property values. What emerges is a striking picture of how the drive to play it safe ends up draining the color from everyday life. Until the 1960s, a landowner could tear down an old brick building and put up almost anything. Then, the rules froze. Writing in late July, Samuel Hughes argues that ugly post-war architecture is what actually triggered those bans. The usual suspect is the local resident worried about parking or construction noise. But listen for a different group Hughes identifies: the NITBY, or not in that backyard. Casual outsiders who look at a proposed concrete block and quietly kill it.
How ugliness helps NIMBYs, and how beauty could help get more homes built. This piece is featured in issue 25 of Works in Progress, which will arrive with subscribers in the second week of August. Subscribe today to get issue 25, and an issue every 2 months after, delivered straight to your door. Western countries used to let landowners build almost anything, anywhere. Now, strict rules freeze the character of most neighborhoods, banning change and densification. Why? One theory is that modern buildings tend to be ugly, leading residents to support rules that exclude them from their neighborhoods. If this is true, then designing beautiful buildings could lead to more development. Housing reformists have vigorously debated this theory. Many British reformists are sympathetic, whereas Australian reformists tend to be skeptical, and Americans come down on both sides. I do believe that ugliness plays a role in hindering development, but not in quite the way usually proposed. Ugliness is probably not a major driver of opposition to development by local people. Local opponents have many other concerns that are at least as important, like disruption from construction, loss of green space, pressure on local services, and diminished social exclusivity. But there is strong circumstantial evidence that ugliness is sometimes a major driver of opposition among people who live nowhere near the development in question. The first group are often called NIMBYs, for not in my backyard. Let us call the second group NITBYs, for not in that backyard. While a few NITBYs are fervent campaigners, most are only casually interested.
Their motives are faint, but basically altruistic. Their question is whether or not, based on a cursory assessment, a development is an objective improvement to its neighborhood. In certain contexts, the ugliness of a development can summon into being a huge cloud of NITBYs, whose interest in the scheme may indeed be superficial, but who can nonetheless be collectively potent. This model is especially compelling in the case of heritage conservation. Until the 1960s, the redevelopment of historic buildings was almost always permitted. Today, it is almost always banned by conservation rules. Supporters of conservationism usually portray it as a response to the destructiveness of post-war planners, while opponents see it as a pretext for suburban NIMBYism. In fact, I shall argue, neither explanation is plausible. On the one hand, post-war planners were no more destructive than the Victorians or Georgians had been. The rate of demolition was historically normal and cannot explain the wildly unprecedented policy response. And on the other hand, there was no need for NIMBYs to invent pretexts to ban new buildings, as they had already successfully prohibited the kinds of development they disliked in the first half of the century. What had changed, and what generated the host of NITBYs that bore conservationism to victory, was the ascendancy of modernist architecture, a style that most people demonstrably find relatively ugly. Conservationism was a reaction to post-war redevelopment, as its proponents claimed, but it was less a reaction to what the modernists destroyed than to what they created. Ugliness and NIMBYism. Most debates about the policy significance of
On this model, local people resent the prospect of having ugliness inflicted upon them. They therefore oppose ugly developments, and politicians implement anti-development policies to placate them. This probably does happen sometimes. Ugliness obviously does affect local people, and it would be surprising if this had no effect at all on their behavior. But a closer look suggests that ugliness plays only a minor role in motivating NIMBYism. One reason for skepticism is that the occasional beautiful developments that do get built still often encounter fevered opposition. Ion, pronounced Ion, in Charleston, South Carolina, is one of the loveliest neighborhoods in North America. It has grown gradually since its founding in 1995, occupying a largely empty site between several existing residential subdivisions. Despite its walkable urbanism, tree-lined streets, and exquisitely detailed houses, thousands of local people petitioned against it when first proposed. The town council initially rejected the scheme, and a tortuous legal battle was fought to downzone the site through a local referendum. The NIMBYs were defeated only after the South Carolina Supreme Court found that zoning decisions cannot be made by referendum. Such stories continue to appear today. The present king of the United Kingdom is an architecture enthusiast, and while he was prince, he orchestrated the delivery of several unusually attractive developments in his official landholdings, which confusingly are called the Duchy of Cornwall, including the famous developments of Poundbury and Nansleden. The Duchy is currently proposing a third at Faversham in Kent. Its proposals show what would be one of the most appealing urban extensions in modern Europe.
Nonetheless, it has triggered hundreds of letters of protest, as well as opposition from Faversham Council, the neighboring councils, and the local member of parliament. Anecdotes like these are only weak evidence, not least because it is possible that the attacks would have been even more intense if the developments had been ugly, but they do suggest that beauty is not a panacea for NIMBYism. A more powerful reason to doubt the role of ugliness in generating NIMBYism is that it gets the timing wrong. It is true that land use rules became far more restrictive in the 20th century. It is also true that the dominant architectural styles became much more unpopular. Visual preference surveys consistently find that most people prefer traditional styles to modernist ones. Viewed from a distance, it looks plausible that the two are causally related. New buildings became visually displeasing to most people, and as a result, they started to push back against them. In fact, however, these changes happened in the wrong order. Restrictive zoning emerged in Germany and Austria-Hungary in the 1890s and spread quickly thereafter. Italian cities began introducing zoning plans in the 1900s. Britain created a national framework for zoning in 1909, and France followed suit in 1919. Zoning spread quickly across the United States in the interwar period. The restrictiveness of early zoning varied by country, but it could be very tight. In Germany and Austria, most suburbs were capped at their existing densities well before 1914 and retain those densities today. Modernist architecture began at least a generation later. It emerged in the 1920s, chiefly in Germany, and spread in the 1930s as a minority style for clients who wanted something distinctively futuristic.
In the United States, its impact was particularly faint, and famous American buildings of the 1930s and 40s, such as the Supreme Court Building, the Empire State Building, and Jefferson Memorial, remained resolutely neoclassical or Art Deco. The global triumph of modernism came only in the 1950s. This means that the Great Downzoning happened in countries where most new buildings were still in the traditional styles dominant in the 19th century, with at most a minority in the novel but decorative styles we now call Art Deco. No switch towards styles perceived as ugly had yet occurred. The general picture was one of continuity with the past. The flats that were banned by early zoning would generally have had classical cornices, pedimented windows, and rusticated basements. In other words, NIMBYism triumphed long before it became true that, in most people's eyes, the average new building was uglier than the average old one. This suggests that, though making development beautiful might palliate NIMBYism somewhat, the effect would be modest. Perhaps this should not surprise us. After all, even the most beautiful neighborhood only emerges after several years of extreme ugliness while the buildings are under construction. And however beautiful buildings may be, development will still have its other well-known impacts on local residents, like loss of light and green space, pressure on infrastructure and services, increase in noise, damage to social cachet, and change in the character of the neighborhood. Removing the problem of ugliness may reduce NIMBY zeal a little, but the number of NIMBYs it satisfies entirely will be small. Was conservationism a response to modernist destructiveness? Ugliness is clearly not the main driver of local opposition to new developments.
This does not, however, mean that ugliness is irrelevant to housing shortages in the West. Today, American pro-housing advocates work to generate statewide or national support for development in order to override the locals, whose representatives control the strict zoning that slows down development and makes housing scarce and expensive. Pro-housing advocates have secured some important victories, but one area where they have almost invariably failed is in enabling more development in historic areas. The same is true for reformist campaigns around the world. Old buildings are protected from redevelopment across the West, even when they sit on the most valuable central land. How did conservation become so powerful? The two most popular theories are A, that conservation rules arose as a response to the unprecedented destructiveness of post-war planners and developers, or B, that they are a clever pretext exploited by local NIMBYs. I believe the evidence contradicts both. Instead, heritage conservation arose once most people began to feel that new buildings were uglier than old ones, generating widespread opposition to the redevelopment of old neighborhoods by people who did not even live in them. The idea of conserving built heritage was not entirely a 20th century invention. The artist William Morris was an early proponent of the idea, establishing the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, whose aim was to prevent the overzealous restoration of churches and other historic buildings in 1877. Morris was considered something of an eccentric in his own time, however, and architectural conservationism did not achieve anything like the popular support it has today until much later. In 1960, most European countries protected only a tiny minority of monuments from development, and even these limited restrictions dated largely from the 1940s and 50s. In most American states, the authorities protected nothing at all. Over the next 20 years, this changed drastically. Heritage registers were created, expanded, and strengthened. Historic districts or conservation areas were declared. Governments halted redevelopment schemes and redirected resources towards refurbishment and restoration. Taken together, these measures were extraordinarily successful. In Paris, plans for the city introduced in the 1950s foresaw the demolition of 2/3 of Paris's city blocks over the next few decades, the bulk of Paris's urban fabric from the 19th century. In Britain, the government actually did demolish at least 1.5 million homes in slum clearance schemes in the post-war decades. This was nearly 10% of the overall housing stock, but since these slums were largely 18th or 19th century buildings, it will have equated to between 15 and 20% of the pre-war stock. The United States seems to have had even higher rates of privately led destruction, with one report finding that nearly half of the 12,000 buildings recorded in the Historic American Building Survey of 1933 had been demolished or seriously mutilated by the middle of the 1960s. Conservation policy brought such demolitions almost to a standstill. In France, 1.8% of pre-1949 dwellings were demolished between 1999 and 2013, an annual rate of 0.13%. German states report even lower rates of demolition of pre-1919 buildings. In Berlin in 2022, just 9 buildings from before 1919 were demolished out of a total of 50,337, a rate of 0.018%.
In North Rhine-Westphalia in 2023, 56 pre-1919 buildings were demolished out of 444,226, a rate of 0.013%. At this rate, it will take North Rhine-Westphalia 7,951 years to demolish its pre-war stock entirely. In Britain, government statistics show a paradoxical increase in the number of pre-1919 dwellings between 2012 and 2024, the result of more homes being subdivided than demolished. Old American buildings are demolished rather more often, partly because they are timber-framed and therefore harder to maintain in safe condition. But in the American Northeast, the annual demolition rate of pre-1920 buildings between 1997 and 2001 was still only 0.25%, while in the West it was slightly over 0.3%. In all these countries, the old buildings that are demolished are usually decayed and neglected. Many are in deprived post-industrial towns, rather than in areas with strong pressure for densification. The standard account of this shift sees the rise of the conservation movement as a response to the unprecedented destruction of heritage by post-war developers and planners. If we take the above figures in isolation, this seems plausible. The problem is that the destructiveness of 1945 to 1970 was really nothing new. Earlier generations had destroyed just as much of their architectural inheritance without generating corresponding resistance. A graphic illustration of this is visible on the Rue François Miron in Paris, where stand Paris's last two fully intact timber-framed houses. Until the 16th century, almost all houses in Paris were timber-framed. In the century since, Paris was never annihilated by a great fire, earthquake, or bombing, unlike Chicago, London, San Francisco, and Tokyo.
But its tens of thousands of timber-framed houses were demolished for redevelopment, until by the mid-20th century, only these two remained. Many of their sites have since been occupied by several progressively larger buildings, demolished and replaced in sequence. This rate of redevelopment was not unusual. London's medieval stock was mostly destroyed in the Great Fire in 1666, but the rebuilt City of London of the late 17th century has also vanished. Only somewhere between 100 and 200 homes survive from this period, though more than 500,000 people lived in the brick-built London of 1700. Some 17th century buildings were destroyed in the Second World War, but the vast majority had already been demolished and replaced in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Assuming 100,000 homes in 1700 and 200 survivors today, that means a destruction rate of 99.8%, considerably more thorough than that of the Great Fire. This process was perhaps even more marked in the United States, where the lack of height restrictions created intense incentives for redevelopment after the invention of elevators and steel frames in the 1880s. Fewer than 20 buildings of any kind survive in New York from before 1800. Boston has perhaps 50 or 100. Almost all of these buildings were already gone before the rise of modernism, demolished in the 19th century or in the furious building activity of the Roaring '20s. The rate of redevelopment could be even faster for certain types of building. In the Gilded Age, Manhattan had several hundred urban palaces, huge houses of the great business dynasties. Perhaps 3/4 were demolished in a remarkably short period in the late 1920s. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II house was demolished in 1926 for the Bergdorf Goodman Building, a department store. The Mrs. William B. Astor House was also demolished in 1926 for the Temple Emmanuel of New York, a magnificent synagogue seating a congregation of 2,500 people. The Elbridge T. Gerry Mansion was demolished in 1929 and replaced by the Pierre, a skyscraper hotel in a French Renaissance style. Ironically, all three of these buildings now have heritage protection, either as individual landmarks or as elements of historic districts. This destructiveness was not limited to the private sector, especially in Europe, where medieval and early modern city centers frequently stood in the way of government schemes. The most famous case of this was road cutting, the policy of driving new arterial roads through city centers to improve traffic circulation, which was unnecessary before the age of the car on generously gridded New World streets. Many of Europe's most famous urban streets were originally cuttings, like Regent Street in London and the Rue de Rivoli in Paris. Although cuttings mainly served a practical function, the tree-lined boulevards they created were also seen as aesthetic improvements. There is one interesting exception to this destructiveness: urban railways. 19th century railways generated huge clouds of steam and coal smoke and were regarded as blights on the neighborhoods they passed through. As a consequence, there are almost no cases in which a railway was cut through a city center. This is why cities like London and Paris have a ring of railway termini around the historic core.
In other words, 19th century people behaved just like 20th century people in respect of the one kind of infrastructure they found overwhelmingly ugly, just as the anti-ugliness theory would predict. Not everyone was happy about the tearing up of the old to make way for modern capital cities. People displaced by public works were obviously upset. Some commentators also regretted the destruction of historic buildings, especially when high-status buildings like palaces were replaced by low-status buildings like apartments. On the other hand, many Georgians and Victorians thought that redevelopment generally made their cities better. Although some ancient buildings were prized, normal houses generally declined in value over time, like cars or computers today. The default assumption was that buildings degraded with use, and hence that a new replacement was probably better. Many people also thought that architects were getting better at designing attractive buildings. In 1868, The Builder, Britain's leading architectural magazine, proclaimed that commercial public works of a magnitude unrivaled since the days of imperial Rome are educating our workmen, from the lowest to the highest, to a style of craftsmanship entirely unknown in this country at the commencement of the present century. Private wealth, under the stimulus already given to good taste, is replacing the dead walls and unmeaning windows of the Georgian style of street building, the poorest and least picturesque that was ever common in any civilized nation, by a not altogether unsuccessful effort to create a Victorian London. The overall picture here is one of striking continuity between the modernists and their predecessors.
The modernists certainly demolished a lot, but not generally more than the Victorians or Georgians. In a sense, they were much less destructive, since they were halted when they had demolished only a substantial minority of the inherited building stock, while the Victorians and Georgians merrily continued until they had torn down almost all of it. The idea that post-war planners were moved by destructive animus towards the past is mostly a myth. Their views about urban change were historically normal and had generally been shared by the wider public. The fact that redevelopment lost the consent of the public in the 1960s and 70s requires some other explanation. Was conservationism a pretext for NIMBYism? If post-war destruction did not cause the conservation movement, what did? Some readers will sense an obvious answer here. Housing reformers have long suspected that the conservation movement is mostly a pretext for NIMBYism. According to this theory, NIMBYs actually oppose development in order to exclude poor people or non-white people from their neighborhoods, or to sustain high property values, or from pure reflexive dislike of change. But since none of these is a persuasive argument for state coercion, NIMBYs therefore have to invent pretextual reasons for opposing development. According to this theory, the idea that we must conserve architectural heritage is one such pretext. The idea that conservation is a front for some other objection can seem plausible. When I attend planning committee meetings, I often have the overwhelming impression that opponents' arguments are heavily pretextual. People who have never shown the slightest interest in heritage, and who have perhaps gutted the historic features of their own homes, suddenly become fanatical champions of some trivial historic object when it stands in the way of a development. Intense interest may also be discovered in bats, newts, hedgehogs, bees, blackbirds, public housing tenants, flood risk, key workers, young people, old people, and so on. As a general explanation for the rise of conservation in the 20th century, however, the pretextual theory is surprisingly weak. The most obvious problem is once again sequencing. The rise of NIMBYism happened long before the rise of the conservation movement. As we have seen, suburban zoning spread across much of Europe before the First World War, and then across North America in the interwar period, while conservation restrictions were extremely limited before the 1940s, and only really became an important constraint on development in the 1960s and 70s. Many countries thus see gaps of 40 or even 70 years between the two movements. Why didn't NIMBYs invent conservationism earlier? Why, indeed, did they bother to invent it in the 1960s, long after they had already succeeded in protecting their affluent suburbs from development using other arguments? The pretextual theory also struggles to explain the priorities of conservationism. As their name suggests, NIMBYs care chiefly about their own backyards, that is, typically middle-class suburbs. Conservationism certainly does sometimes protect such places, but it is not restricted to them.
It also protects working-class housing, commercial downtowns, public buildings, isolated country houses, and rural churches. In fact, it has often had far more effect on these buildings than it has on suburban areas, partly because suburbs were already protected by zoning, and partly because post-war governments wanted to clear slums, not middle-class neighborhoods. In other words, the conservation movement has the priorities of a NITBY movement, not a NIMBY one. The difference between conservationist and NIMBY priorities is starkly illustrated by the divergent trajectories of city center districts. City centers with less historic build stock have frequently seen massive densification since 1950 because they have neither beautiful buildings for NITBYs to protect nor many local residents to object on NIMBY grounds. Thus, many American, Canadian, and Australian cities have seen forests of skyscrapers rising in their downtowns, while their vast suburbs, full of home-owning NIMBYs, remain petrified at low densities. Urbanists write about an urban transect, with densities gradually rising towards the center. These cities have developed a distinctive L transect, sheer at the core but flat everywhere else. This is the urban form that arises where local NIMBYism is a powerful force, while NITBY conservation has less relevance. By contrast, European city centers have been more perfectly frozen than perhaps any other kind of neighborhood. The building stock of central Paris, Rome, or Madrid has hardly changed at all since 1960. When European municipalities want to develop a skyscraper district, they generally have to find a low-end suburban site for it, like Paris's La Défense or Madrid's Azca.
If current plans for tall buildings around the peripheric ring road go ahead, Paris may end up with a gentle U transect, with its highest densities displaced to the periphery. The obvious reason for this is that European city centers are where historic buildings are concentrated. They have no special significance for most NIMBYs, although they have often now gentrified. Many centers were poor or depopulated in the 1960s, but they are the natural focus of NITBY's efforts. Where European cities have densified their centers since 1945, it is generally downstream of heavy bomb damage, as in Frankfurt and London. One famous study found that the Blitz ultimately made London's economy 10% larger by enabling higher densities on former bomb sites. If London's development restrictions were solely driven by NIMBYism, this would be inexplicable. Sites where density had been randomly lowered to zero in 1941-1945 would, if anything, be expected to have lower density today, since the NIMBYs would have been resisting densification from a lower baseline. The reason that bomb damage enabled higher subsequent densities is that development is often blocked by NITBY protection of heritage architecture, not NIMBY opposition to density. The fight against uglification. The true explanation of the spread of conservation is before our eyes: the rise of perceived ugliness. Redevelopment in the post-war era did not become more common or more destructive of heritage, but it did become, in the view of most people, uglier. This may have made people even more hostile to redevelopment near them, but its politically decisive effect was to make people more hostile to many kinds of redevelopment that did not affect them personally.
Most people are not principled opponents of redevelopment as such. Even today, developments on former industrial or logistics sites are often widely popular, like Noma in Washington, D.C., or Coaldrop's Yard in London. But many people are principled opponents of redevelopment when it seems to uglify places. Very many people dislike the idea of their city or their country becoming uglier, even when they do not live near the development in question. They lend low-level, passive support to conservationist campaigns, support which aggregates into a powerful force in a democratic society. How did people come to expect that new buildings would be uglier than what came before? As we have seen, this view was not standard historically. There are two main causes. First, in the middle of the 20th century, traditional architectural styles were superseded by modernism, characterized by lack of ornament, repetitive facade patterns, and the use of exposed steel and concrete. This style emerged in the 1920s and became dominant for everything except suburban housing in the 1950s. As noted above, this style is broadly unpopular with the public. Replacement of pre-war buildings in traditional styles with post-war buildings in modernist ones will thus, to most people, constitute uglification. This is the main reason that redevelopment switched from being aesthetically neutral to being uglifying. Second, at around the same time, mass car ownership became dominant. Unlike modernist architecture, cars are basically popular. But it is nonetheless obvious that although individuals benefit from cars, spaces are degraded by heavy vehicle traffic. This is irrelevant to how people feel about some kinds of redevelopment, but it is worth mentioning because of how it affects views of street cuttings.
A 19th century boulevard was an airy, tree-lined space along which horse-drawn carriages flowed, roughly at walking speed. On the whole, people seem to have preferred them to narrow side streets, as contemporary property models illustrate. By contrast, nobody prefers living near a modern highway to the extent that the authorities often build sight and sound barriers around them. The anti-ugliness theory of conservationism lines up strikingly with the timing of events.
Developers had been demolishing vast quantities of historic stock for thousands of years, with barely a whisper of conservationist resistance. Then, within 10 or 15 years of the ascendancy of an architectural style that the public disliked, an immense movement to halt the replacement of old buildings appeared almost from nowhere. This theory also explains the priorities of the conservation movement. On the one hand, as noted above, conservationists have successfully protected a much wider range of pre-1914 buildings than NIMBYs have, including in city centers and other places where NIMBYs are scarce or absent. On the other hand, conservationists have been far less effective in defending post-war modernist heritage, being either indifferent to it themselves or unable to mobilize wider public support. There do exist conservation groups defending modernist architecture, like the 20th Century Society in Britain, and some high-profile modernist buildings have received conservation protection, but the numbers are tiny relative to pre-war architecture. In England, 300 post-war buildings had been listed as of 2003, apparently growing to about 500 in 2015, out of some 375,000 listed buildings in total.
The American National Register has a blanket 50-year rule, almost never including anything built within the last half-century. It also seems to me that the anti-ugliness theory is a plausible account of the emotional character of the conservation movement. It is true that many conservationists are not explicitly anti-modernist, and that today the orthodox high-status view is to support conservationism for old architecture and modernism for new ones. I suspect, however, that conservationists were appalled by uglification, but sought to avoid direct confrontation with high-status modernism by sublimating their appreciation of beauty into appreciation of heritage. Conservationists could thus promote traditional architecture without attracting charges of pastiche-mongering. In other words, many conservationists secretly love old buildings because they are beautiful, while pretending to love them because they are old. Ugliness and the housing shortage. How much impact does conservation have on the housing shortage? The answer is complicated. Even in the European countries with the oldest build stock, only a fifth of housing dates from before 1919, while in the United States, just 6% does. This suggests that rules protecting old buildings would do little to prevent the construction of new ones. But because historic buildings are concentrated in city centers, and because conservation systems tend to restrict what can be done in the environs of old buildings as well as within their curtilages, their effect is much greater than the raw statistics suggest. In fact, in most European cities, centers are effectively solid phalanxes of conservation designations, with new development largely displaced to inferior sites on the urban periphery. The impact of conservation in the United States is smaller, but still considerable. Manhattan, Central Boston, and San Francisco are not under blanket conservation designations like Paris, Amsterdam, Madrid, or Rome. But large areas still fall under conservation protections, often exactly the areas where YIMBYs would most like to enable development. This means that conservation, and hence ugliness, still acts as a significant constraint on development, albeit a less important one than the general rise of suburban zoning. Cogent arguments may be given for the redevelopment of historic neighborhoods. Densifying central areas of cities creates new housing where it is most needed and where it contributes most to economic growth. It enables people to walk and cycle to work or to rely on public transport. New buildings could be safer, better insulated, and more environmentally sustainable than their predecessors. For most Westerners today, however, the prospect of destroying their city's historic neighborhoods remains a horrible one. People feel implicitly that we possess a finite stock of beautiful buildings and that they are more or less irreplaceable. When one is destroyed, we lose forever a part of our inheritance and condemn our children to live in a permanently uglier world. So long as people feel this, they will never tolerate the large-scale destruction of historic building stock, no matter what ingenious arguments YIMBYs make for it. Their dread of ugliness will hang over our cities like a curse, freezing them in the last moment of their beauty. If that curse can be broken, it will not be by the arguments of economists and transport planners, but by confidence that change is not disfigurant and that it will yield cities we can love.
Samuel Hughes is an editor at Works in Progress. Artwork by Daniel Cox. The society was nicknamed the Anti-Scrape Society because of its objection to the practice of scraping off later plasterwork to reveal a building's original bare stone. Morris considered the latter additions worth preserving as part of a building's story. The one partial exception to this pattern is the American South, the most demolition-prone region in the Western world, where the rate was 0.8% annually. This seems to result from a mixture of urban poverty and the rapid decay of timber buildings in a subtropical climate.
Samuel Hughes leaves you staring at a frozen city block, where strict conservation rules act as a shield against the threat of an ugly modern building. Turn the page to Amogh Dimri, and that same fear of making a visible mistake shrinks down to a single homeowner staring at a paint swatch. Hughes points to voters blocking new construction out of a collective dread of bad architecture. Dimri scales that dread down to the individual buyer, tracking how financial anxiety traps consumers in a permanent color recession of white, beige, and gray. What jumps out reading these two together is how they trace the increasingly bland physical world back to the exact same risk aversion. For Hughes, freezing a neighborhood is a political tool to stop unwanted change. For Dimri, painting a house universal khaki is financial self-defense. Read alongside Hughes, Dimri's piece suggests that a sea of silver cars and gray living rooms isn't just a boring design trend. It looks more like a symptom of the exact same anxiety that stops a new apartment building from going up. The shared assumption is hard to miss. People are so terrified of getting a design choice wrong and paying a penalty for it that they choose the safest possible option, or choose not to change anything at all.
The color recession may be permanent. Consumers are so afraid of getting colors wrong, they don't use them at all. When Bob Buchter, a 79-year-old house painter who also goes by Dr. Color, began his career in the 1970s, the job was a lot more fun. Acid-tripping hippies in his hometown of San Francisco wanted wild-ass color combinations for their facades, he told me. Armed with mustard yellow, lime green, and vermilion paint, Buchter happily transformed drab Victorian and Edwardian homes into vivid eye candy. Today, almost no one seems to be looking to the hues of jelly beans for inspiration for their home, or car, or couch, or fridge, or practically anything else. Since the late 2000s, Buchter has watched with dismay as essentially colorless colors, think white, beige, gray, have taken over. It's not even 3 shades or 4 shades of gray. It's just one dark gray, he said. It's an ignorant way to paint your house. A study of homes in Washington, D.C. last year found a similarly sharp rise in the number of gray homes, especially in the most rapidly gentrifying wards. Color trends used to come and go, but the color recession that began early this century has dragged on far longer than the heyday of avocado green in the 1960s or hot pink in the 1980s. Our top color from 2000 to 2010 was Pelham beige. We thought that would never change. Sue Wadden, the director of color marketing at the paint company Sherwin-Williams, told me. The next decade, she said, gray was dominant. Like gray, gray, more gray. Sherwin-Williams' current list of its most popular colors for home interiors features ice cube and crushed ice, both white, and agreeable gray and passive, both gray. Colors are now getting warmer again, Wadden noted hopefully, but they're warmer whites. The company's color of 2026 is universal khaki, otherwise known, unfortunately, as greige. The color drought doesn't affect just paint companies. According to Pantone, a color technology company influential among designers and manufacturers across industries, 2026's color of the year is Cloud Dancer. Yes, white. The share of new cars in grayscale colors rose from 60% in 2004 to 80% in 2023. Production of purple cars dropped 93% over that period, gold by 97%. I don't know how many different variants of silver and gray there could possibly be, but I think BMW and Mercedes have discovered it. Carl Brower, the analyst behind the report, told me. Some color trends may look like a matter of whim. In the 2006 film The Devil Wears Prada, the imperious fashion editor Miranda Priestley, played by Meryl Streep, delivered the now famous monologue in which she berates her assistant Andy Sachs, Anne Hathaway, for being blithely unaware of how her own cerulean blue sweater was in fact a product of a high-fashion embrace of the hue by the people in this room. 20 years on, in this year's The Devil Wears Prada 2, Sachs is gently discouraged from wearing anything colorful, This is quiet luxury, Stanley Tucci's Nigel Kipling explains, while assembling a wardrobe of grays and taupes. That, he adds, gesturing at the pink garment in her hands, is like a screaming guitar solo. What's plain in the Prada sequel and nearly everywhere else is that color fads are no longer dictated from on high by style gurus. Remarkably, shoppers' personal taste may not be much of a factor either. Although some studies show that people tend to feel more cheerful in the company of oranges and yellows, more calm among blues and greens, and sometimes more depressed around too much gray, their spending habits say otherwise. 2 decades into the color recession, the observable preferences of landlords, homeowners, car buyers, and consumers have grown detached from what people claim to like, and little evidence indicates that walls or cars or appliances in hues other than greige are coming back anytime soon. For thousands of years, color was an aristocratic luxury. From the 14th century BCE to the 15th century CE, only Mediterranean royalty, priests, and nobles wore anything dyed Tyrian purple, because acquiring the color could involve slicing out the mucus glands of special sea snails, fermenting them in salt for days, boiling them for days more, and then pouring urine on newly dyed garments to bind the color to the fabric. A single gram of the dye required at least 10,000 snails. The deep red of Kermes crimson in ancient Rome involved grinding dried female Kermes insect corpses. By the Middle Ages, some landlords accepted the dye as rent. The lurid verdigris that adorns the dining room walls of George Washington's Mount Vernon estate was a labor-intensive status symbol, achieved by oxidizing copper plates with vinegar vapors and then mixing the resulting patina with oil. In 1856, after an 18-year-old English chemistry student named William Henry Perkin accidentally invented synthetic dye while trying to cure malaria, a range of colors, including his own snail-free Tyrian purple, became widely available for textiles. Suddenly, anyone could don the color the Roman Emperor Caligula allegedly killed the king of Mauritania for wearing.
Perkin's discovery spurred other lab-made dyes, which lowered costs and applied color to a widening variety of goods. Indiscriminate demand duly followed. By the early 20th century, Sherwin-Williams' ads were encouraging homeowners to repaint every season, warm colors for winter and cool shades in the summer. Henry Ford may have once said that buyers could get a Ford Model T in any color so long as it was black, but even he succumbed. In 1927, nearly 2 decades after the first Model T rolled off the assembly line, Ford hoped to revive interest in his car by painting it red. The effects of our chromatic revolution are everywhere apparent, a 1928 Saturday Evening Post article called "The New Age of Color" observed. Cars are borrowing their hues from the waters of the Nile, from the sands of Arabia, the plumage of birds, and the fire of gems. The 20s were warring. Stocks were climbing, Hitler had yet to rise to power, and the cars plying American highways bore the day-glow colors of tropical birds. What could be more delightful? By mid-century, a put-together, color-coordinated lifestyle was what it meant to be middle class, Regina Blaszczyk, a color historian, told me. Buyers matched their shoes to their suit and hat, and their car to the exterior of their home. Mad Men-era color oracles in high-rise offices offered industry executives predictions that promised to boost sales and solve problems. In his 1945 book, Selling with Color, the color consultant Faber Buren wrote about the value of using warm and light colors for hospital patient rooms, but a more clinical blue-green hue for operating rooms, to reduce eye fatigue by posing a contrast to the red hue of innards. Alexander Schoss, a biologist, found in 1979 that a shade of pink, known as Baker-Miller pink or drunk tank pink, could calm inmates and reduce fights in prisons. The post-war decades, in short, were gloriously colorful in the United States. The decline would be precipitous. Institutional constraints on color were already starting to emerge during this period. Post-war developers, for example, worked to meet the immense demand for housing by building entire neighborhoods with a handful of floor plans and a limited palette. In the name of protecting property values, homeowner associations attached to these developments decided that uniformity is actually a positive. Evan McKenzie, a University of Illinois Chicago professor who studies HOAs, told me.
Many mandated earth tone palettes for home facades and even restricted the colors of street visible features such as mailboxes, roofs, and curtains. Instead of resenting these limits, buyers came to see grayish paint as securing their investment. You'd want a neighborhood where you can restrict your neighbor, because your neighbor might do something crazy, Mackenzie said. Meanwhile, in the auto industry, the passage of the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976 narrowed the range of financially feasible colors for cars. Roy Kearney, the head of product strategy at the car painting company Axalta, told me that the more eco-friendly coating that replaced lacquer paints was more expensive, which raised the cost of delivering variety. Stocking neutrals, which sold reliably, was far easier and more cost-effective than testing the appeal of various hues. Time has reinforced those constraints.
Given that ever more auto sales are for used vehicles, shoppers sensibly prefer to buy cars in inoffensive colors in case they need to resell. When it comes to car colors, it's not just about personal preference or what makes you happiest, Kelley Blue Book warns. If you're looking to retain your car's value, it's best to play it safe and choose neutral colors. Never mind that resale market data defy this conventional wisdom. A 2024 study of 1.2 million 3-year-old used cars found that yellow, orange, and green cars depreciated less than silver, gray, and white ones. Big purchases breed risk aversion. A 2025 survey of real estate agents by Better Homes and Gardens found that 84% recommend repainting house interiors in white, gray, or beige before selling, particularly if the walls are red. Yet this market-appeasing logic doesn't always satisfy the market. One Zillow study last year found that olive green and navy blue walls actually boosted home prices compared with white. Even so, Alana Cowan, a graphic designer, still found herself puzzling over the difference between Chantilly lace and alabaster recently, while figuring out what to paint the walls of her new house in Arkansas. Apparently, there's 30 shades of white, she told me. She was too plagued by doubt to consider anything more adventurous. What if I hate it? What if I get tired of it? What if the next buyer doesn't like it and that's the reason they don't buy the house? This logic repeats itself from one room to the next, a phenomenon some decry as the HGTV-ification of America. Among renovating homeowners, 72% choose inoffensive stainless steel appliances, according to one recent report. White and off-white dominated kitchen wall colors and backsplash tiles.
Amy Wolfe, an interior decorator and color forecaster, told me that she's seen cocooning, or seeking safety in one's purchases, solidify gray's dominance in every product sphere. When people buy a sofa now, they don't want to hate it in 2 years, so they're not going to go with orange, she said. Yet grayification isn't as neutral as buyers believe. A review last year of more than 100 studies of the effect of color on emotion found that gray consistently triggered fatigue, boredom, or sadness. Stephen Westland, a professor who studies color science, attributes the rise of gray to the fact that people are scared of using color, he told me, even though the use of color can make you feel happier psychologically. I wish I could say that change is on the horizon, that after decades in retreat, color is making a comeback. Here and there, some consumers are letting color back in. Amy Freed, a retired lawyer from Maryland, decided to repaint her home and hired Wolfe to help pick out the best shades of gray. Freed was shocked when Wolfe suggested orange for the entryway. The color seemed too bold and aggressive and so out of my comfort zone, Freed told me. I don't like color. Nevertheless, Wolfe persuaded her to try it out, and the foyer quickly became this incredibly fun, joyful thing for me, Freed said. But her experience is notable precisely because it's unusual. Millennial pink in the 2010s, Barbie pink in 2023, and brat green in 2024 were welcome counterpoints to the color recession, but they were also short-lived. They never quite translated into real-world buying habits for most consumers. Color experts across multiple sectors told me, with varying degrees of wistfulness, that bright shades are ill-equipped to return. The structural obstacles to color are not going away. Almost 70% of new single-family homes were built into HOAs in 2024, the second highest year on record after 2020. In a data-driven car marketplace, the color recession has become self-reinforcing. The preponderance of grays ensures that there's too little information to even gauge demand for other colors. Color enthusiasts are now largely stuck sneaking bright hues into gray. Color is coming back, Nancy Lockhart, a co-director of the Inter-Society Color Council, a nonprofit professional group, assured me. But it's coming back so subtly that you almost don't notice it. In a show of defiance, Axalta did pick Solar Boost, a warm and inviting orange tone, as its automotive color of the year. But Kearney, the company's product strategy head, told me that the company doesn't actually expect many orange cars to roll off the assembly line anytime soon. The choice of Solar Boost was simply to nudge the market in a livelier direction. The hope, Kearney explained, was that a gray car out there may be gray, but may have a slight twinge of red. A marginally brighter gray might not seem worth celebrating. Dr. Color, the San Francisco house painter, certainly can't understand why so many people are denying themselves the pleasure of vivid, kaleidoscopic hues. His house is painted in no fewer than 11. Yellows, golds, ochres, cinnamons, with touches of blues, reds, and gold leaf, and purple and green, he said. His home, in all of its peacocking beauty, stands out on Google Maps. His neighbors, however, are playing it safe. Their homes are painted in different shades of greige.
A freshly painted gray living room and a frozen historic city block rest on the exact same foundation, a quiet dread of making a mistake. The drive to protect a home's resale value or block a hideous new apartment building ends up stripping the color and surprise from the physical world. Playing it safe keeps the worst designs at bay, but it also locks out the brilliant ones. The question left hanging in all this beige paint and preserved brick is simple. What would it actually take to risk making something a little bit ugly again?